Hi, everybody. We're the Wildlife Wire, and we are back with our next episode of Wildlife Biologists Rank the Animals of Planet Zoo. And today we actually decided to do a twofer for you. So, of course, we spun the wheel and got the Southern White Rhinoceros, which you see pictured here. But we also decided that this would be a good time to actually cover two animals at once, and we will also be covering the newly released Black Rhinoceros that was in the arid pack. So these are two very cool, very unique species. Despite looking very similar to many people, they are quite different and they have very different roles within their ecosystem. So just to start off, the scientific names of these two animals, the white rhino is Ceratotherium simum, which is very interesting. Therium is the Greek word for beast, and a lot of prehistoric mammals have the therium in their genus, but the white rhinoceros is actually the only modern animal that does have that. So it's the only surviving animal from the Pleistocene that has therium in its genus name, which is very interesting. And then you also have the black rhinoceros, which is Diceros bicornis, which is basically just two different ways of saying two horn. But you'll notice that these two rhino species are different enough to be in their own genus. So with that, I'm gonna leave it to Justin to kind of explain the great habitat that he's built for us and why these rhinos are a lot more different than you probably think.
Yeah, so today we have a habitat that's based on Namibia, right?
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure I was
It's
pronouncing it
always a hard
correctly.
word. Yeah.
Right. Um, and so with this habitat, we have a combination of some open grasslands and then some denser brush, open woodland kind of habitat. Both of these habitats provide enough food for these rhinos, but the rhinos select for it differently. So with this open woodlands here, you can see the grass is pretty short compared to these rhinoceroses. That's because the southern white rhino is a grazer. So what it likes to do is it has a nice wide lip that allows it to kind of grasp the grass and tear it and eat it. And it's pretty interesting because the southern white rhino is essentially an ecosystem engineer because no other grazer within their respective habitat can keep the grass as low as they can. In areas where these rhinos used to inhabit but now don't, grasses actually are longer than they typically would have been with these rhinoceroses. And that's really interesting because that low level of grass most likely provides habitat for a lot of different species that once the grass reaches a certain length at like a certain height, it might make it, unsuitable for perhaps some, songbirds or even like the insects that would live in the soil. Now, I think it's a good time to switch to the black rhino to kind of show the difference. So now we've got the black rhinoceros, and the habitat the black rhinoceros prefers is a little denser brush than the white rhinoceros is found in, and the denser brush provides a little bit different in food. So with the open grasslands, all that you're really going to be finding is grass because it's a grassland. You're not going to be finding a ton of browse, which is kind of like this woody vegetation that kind of surrounds it here. And the one way that we can tell that this animal is a browser instead of a grazer is if you look at its lip, because right here on its lip, it kind of curves down and kind of gives it like almost like a hook. And what that allows it to do is essentially grasp onto a branch of browse and kind of pull the leaves off of it to eat them. Now, what's really interesting with the black rhinoceros is they prefer this kind of, dense brush and open woodlands, but as soon as it becomes closed woodlands, they actually don't prefer it. It becomes a little bit too dense for them, and in terms of grazing, they just, they don't like it. But they do use these thickets as a lot of resting habitat. Another interesting thing about the habitat that the black rhinoceros selects is it's sometimes considered low quality, meaning that there isn't a huge diversity of plant species. And while diversity in species is really important for the health of an environment. For a species like a rhinoceros, which is very large and needs to consume a lot of this vegetation because it's not the most nutritious, but if they consume a lot of it, then it kind of makes up for it. If you're eating, if you're in a habitat that is dominated by fewer species, then you're able to consume what works for you the best in the amount that you need to sustain yourself.
Yeah. I mean, first off, the black rhino looks gorgeous.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is so good. Like they did a really, really good job with the black. I mean, even just looking at it next to the white rhino here,
Hmm.
um, ooh, they're doing a little bit of fencing too.
Yeah.
It's nothing really serious. That's one of the things with a lot of like the dominance displays is they're not nearly as intense as they would be in the wild. And this isn't really something we'd see between species a lot of the time. You do see
Hmm.
rhinos fighting with members of the same species a lot, but as Justin said, the white rhino and the black rhino have very different fine scale habitats that they're living in that they don't really come into contact that much with each other because they're just feeding on very different types of plants. And it's something that we always like to reiterate because everybody just thinks, oh, you eat plants. Not all plants are the same. And so if you're specialized to eat different types of plants, then you're not really going to be in competition with a lot of other herbivores in your area. And it's very hard to specialize in a lot of these different plants because they are so unpalatable and tough to eat and come loaded with toxins and compounds. So it's very difficult. But
Yeah.
the other thing you can see here is that they're both kind of the same shade of gray, which, considering they're called the white rhino and black rhino, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The reason for that is because when the Dutch were colonizing Africa, it was actually that the white rhino was their word for wide, referring to its wider square lip that is designed for grazing, whereas the black rhino has a hooked lip that's better for browsing on woody vegetation. And some reason that translation happened, and so now we have white and black, even though they're pretty much the same color. So when in doubt, we always blame the Dutch for weird name things in Africa. But still, very different, very unique animals, big, important bulk feeders, these big mega herbivores. We don't have a whole lot of them left in the modern world. So each and every one of them is super duper important. And I feel like just with what a lot of the other wildlife channels on YouTube have said, these guys have gotten really underrated. I think a lot of wildlife channels, like, they hold on to a lot of myths about these guys and treat it as fact, is that these are kind of these stupid, dumb brutes, and just kind of inferior to elephants and hippos when they're really not at all. And they have a lot of very unique things that make them special and important. And a lot of what those other channels are saying is factually incorrect.
Yeah, and to touch on another point about the habitat partitioning, so like the differences in what habitats these animals select, the white rhinoceros actively avoids essentially like sloped hilly habitat and areas near like riparian areas. And so it's just kind of, as we were talking about the very fine choices and where these animals are choosing to rest or feed or everything, it's a lot finer than you might even expect because it's like, oh, just a hit like a slope that's maybe above like 25%, for example. They're just like, oh, that's too much. And so that's a really fine, like small detail, but to these animals, that's a major difference in, where they're deciding to move about the landscape and feed.
Right. And actually, going off of movement, an interesting thing about rhinos, and this is something that is true of a lot of these mega herbivores that we don't really have a lot of anymore, and they're mostly restricted to Africa and Southern Asia. But with white rhinos in particular, the reason they're such an important maintainer of these grasslands and preventing woodland encroachment, part of it is because they just, as Justin said, they graze the grass down so short that then woody vegetation that would normally be quite concealed gets exposed, and a lot of these smaller browsing antelopes come in and feed off of that because it's better quality nutrition than what they might find in a more open area where they feel safe. And that prevents that woody encroachment, which also prevents bushfires. And so these guys are great for fire suppression. They're far better than we are at it. And you actually see in areas that have lost white rhinos that the rates of wildfires are significantly increased. And so these guys are really, really important for shaping the ecosystem in that regard. Another thing is that something that we have touched a little bit on with some of our predator videos is that predators affect where prey will move. And it's something that we call the ecology of fear, the landscape of fear. Very, very important ecological process. It really helps shape environments. It contributes to biodiversity and can really help protect plants. But herbivores do provide a benefit where when they poop, they are dispersing seeds, they are enriching that soil with nutrients, they're cycling in new nutrients. And so a mega herbivore like a white rhino, it doesn't feel the effects of the landscape of fear to the degree as almost all the other herbivores in its environment. So they don't move in the same way as these herbivores, and they move across the environment in a more uniform way. And that allows for nutrient cycling and seed dispersal back into these areas that other herbivores aren't using as well, and can help re-energize some of these more high-risk feeding zones, which is really important. And we're not saying, oh, the landscape of fear is bad, because if it was bad, then you would have all these herbivores overgrazing these areas because they're not scared of being attacked by a predator. But if you have these smaller amounts of herbivores still providing this nutrition to that area, that's important to keep those areas sustaining long term. So rhinos are really, really important habitat managers. And it's something that is fairly often overlooked. People understand it with elephants, they understand it with hippos, but rhinos do quite a lot of this as well. And that's really concerning because we are losing a lot of rhinos very, very fast. They have a much more critical conservation concern than elephants and hippos do, for sure.
One thing to maybe mention about the white rhinos before we move on from habitat is that since they are kind of strictly grazers, they also, when seasonal declines in food happen, they use their fat reserves to help meet their nutritional needs. And I know, Dominic, you had something about kind of their digestive system that you maybe wanted to touch on. I don't know if you want to do that here or not.
Right. Yeah, we can do that now. So in our Okapi video, which if you haven't watched it, we definitely recommend you check it out because it tells you a lot about just the complexity of digesting plant matter, and that it's not easy at all whatsoever, and that you really need to have a specialized gut for it. Okapi are ruminants, which is a great big group of these hoofed mammals, these ungulates, that use a very complex amount of foregut fermentation in order to extract nutrients from plants. Rhinos aren't ruminants. In fact, none of the odd-toed ungulates, which is what rhinos are part of because they have 3 toes, so they're in the odd-toed ungulate order Perissodactyla, with horses and tapirs, as well as a bunch of other groups that are now extinct. These guys are what we call hindgut fermenters. And there are some even-toed ungulates that are hindgut fermenters as well. Hippos are hindgut, pigs are hindgut, even some non-ungulates like elephants and gorillas, they are hindgut fermenters. And what that means is that for the most part, a lot of their digestive system is very similar to ours, where you have your esophagus and it goes into your stomach and you have your intestines. But after the intestines, there's this giant organ called a cecum. And this is your fermentation chamber. So in ruminants and foregut fermenters, like most of the even-toed ungulates, you have those big complex chambers in the stomach that are fermenting the plant material. With hindgut, you're doing it afterwards in the cecum. And so that can have potential drawbacks and advantages. There's different trade-offs to doing hindgut versus foregut. Hindgut works better the bigger you are. So that's why we see a lot of the really, really big mega herbivores doing hindgut rather than foregut. And the other thing too is that what is really breaking down this plant material isn't your digestive acids or anything like that. It's a whole community of microbes, microscopic bacteria that are they themselves equipped to break down plant material and convert it into energy. And let's say you have a bad batch of microbes. Well, if it's in the hindgut, then it's a lot easier to get rid of a lot of those bad microbes and restart from scratch with, a better batch. It's a lot harder to do that if you're in foregut. However, the trade-off is that it's less efficient. So you have to graze or browse a lot more. But if you're at that larger size and you're grazing and browsing constantly, you can afford to have much lower quality food than something that's smaller and using that foregut fermentation. So these guys are really important for also just reducing spread of invasive plants, because a lot of invasive plants usually get to that degree because they're not very palatable and they're hard for a lot of the herbivores to digest. These big mega herbivores, it doesn't matter to them because they just need to eat so much, and they're eating so much all day. And hindgut fermentation should be familiar to us. As I said, it's something that gorillas do. Humans, our ancestors used to do hindgut fermentation. Our appendix is a vestigial cecum. So it's a cecum that no longer works because humans had a shift in diet that went from less plants with cellulose in it to more of parts of plants like fruits and grains and roots, parts of plants that don't contain cellulose, as well as lots of meat. And so we didn't really need a cecum anymore. So it just kind of became vestigial. So we still have it, but it doesn't really work anymore. But that's kind of the important digestive process. And you do have to put in a lot of evolutionary work and specialization to be able to eat plants. Plants are not just something simple to eat at all.
Yeah, and when we're talking about like evolutionary work, it's not necessarily that these animals are choosing to get these advantages and adaptions. What they're essentially doing is the animals that are able to consume and digest these, the plants and have that microbiome in their stomach that allows it, those are the ones that are going to be surviving and reproducing. And so evolution is basically selecting those individuals to persist and continue and pass on their genes, so we get more animals like that. And then that leads to that specialization in the, body plan, the gut, and the cecum.
Yes. Yeah. Evolution is random mutation. That's one thing that people forget. And it's just that the random mutation happens to be super beneficial, and it can lead an entire species down a particular path. And it's very hard to comprehend because it's just such a long scale of time, much longer than any human lifetime, that it's really, really hard for people to comprehend.
One more thing on the black rhino, and only both of you mentioned its curved lip, but I'm not sure if we mentioned the specific term for that. They have a prehensile lip, and most people kind of think of monkeys with their prehensile tails or things like that, giraffes with their prehensile tongue. It basically means it's the capability of grasping things, like you both mentioned, grasping leaves and other things off of plants to eat, and just a lot of really small muscles in these appendages allow them to do that. So just wanted to mention the specific term on that.
Yeah,
I can go ahead and talk about the couple differences I found if you want me to now.
Yeah.
In my research. Okay. So yeah, I'll start with black rhinos. One thing that I kind of found interesting difference between the two is that when they get agitated, these rhinos, For the black rhinos, their tail points straight up in the air, and then white rhinos, it kind of curves almost like a pig, but it's also pointed up. Black rhinos, like Justin was mentioning, really don't form social groups just because of the habitat that they are in, but they do have a dominance hierarchy and do display territorial behavior, mostly males. They rest at houses, and these are typically or spots that they visit a lot, basically. Their range is between 2 and 100 kilometers squared, or 20 and 100 kilometers squared, sorry. They aren't very aggressive compared to things like hippos. Their olfaction and scent marking is very important for their communication. And they have a broad vocal repertoire, the black rhinos versus the white rhinos, where vocalization is limited. Like both Justin and Dominic mentioned, they're fairly sedentary, and they also have a symbiotic relationship, both of these rhinos, with some birds, which is pretty cool. The red-billed oxpecker in the black rhinos helps pick off insects and serves as an alarm call for the rhinos. And then white rhinos, they mostly have a mutualistic relationship with a cattle egret or a keep starling, which basically does the same thing for them. One thing about the white rhinos is that they have 2 horns of unequal size, and in females it's actually a bit longer and thinner, which is interesting. Black rhinos are, I have the term up here, polygynous, which means one male mates with multiple females, and then in white rhinos, they're polygynandrous, so both sexes mate with multiple partners. White rhinos have a lifespan of 46 to 50 years in the wild, and then males and white rhinos urinate to determine boundary markings. And of course, their olfactory senses help play in that too.
Yeah, white rhinos are quite social. The technical term for a group of rhinos is called a crash, which is kind of funny. And something also with the red-billed oxpecker is it's not just a mutualistic relationship. Oxpeckers can get parasitic as well. So if a rhino has a cut through its skin that with an open wound, sometimes the oxpeckers will peck through that and they'll drink the blood. So it's very interesting where sometimes they can be really helpful to a lot of different herbivores, but at the same time, they can also, open up wounds and give them new infections at the same time if they're really hungry. So interesting set of trade-offs for sure. And as Lane mentioned, scent marking and using olfactory is very important for rhinos in terms of communicating with each other, understanding where each other's territories are, because even though they will fight with each other for dominance, you don't want to fight if you don't have to. Avoid that unnecessary risk to yourself. Rhino fights can get lethal. Those horns are what's primarily used in social combat. That's their main function, and the horns are very impressive in that regard, and they do a mix of kind of fencing and wrestling with them, and it's these great cataclysmic fights. And what we saw between the white rhino and the black rhino here in game was very tame compared to how serious it really can get at times. But the important thing to understand is there's this myth that rhinos have poor eyesight. And it really just came from guides saying, oh, it's got poor eyesight because we got close and it lashed out, which isn't really, a good sound method to say that the animal has poor eyesight. But this is something that has kind of become fact to a lot of people, and it's not something that a lot of other channels really fact check. And in 2008, there was an opportunity where a black rhino died of natural causes, and a team was able to get access to one of its retinas. So they actually did vision tests on this black rhino eye, and what they found was that the vision wasn't poor. It was about the same as a rabbit's, a little bit worse than a house cat's, but not by much. And they can make out people from up to 200 meters away, so about two
Wow.
football fields for Americans. So their vision's pretty good. It's average for a mammal. Mammals in general, compared to a lot of other groups, have relatively poor vision because during the age of the dinosaurs, all mammals were having a nocturnal or burrowing lifestyle, which means that your eyes are better adjusted for low light conditions rather than having just good daytime vision overall or good color vision. Primates got color vision back because as frugivores, you want to be able to see different colors, particularly reds. So humans and primates have really good vision for mammalian standards, but that doesn't mean that other mammals have really bad vision at all whatsoever. And so a lot of rhino aggression that is, put on their reputation is, oh, they're dumb and they have poor eyesight, is really mostly down to poor guiding etiquette and getting too close to an animal that you shouldn't be that close to. They can see you just fine. And, that's kind of an issue where like this, we knew this in 2008. And, if you're making a channel and, your whole argument against why rhinos are garbage is based on a statement that's factually incorrect, like that's not good content. That's not being a good content creator, especially for content that's supposed to be educational. Like you really need to know how to research and make sure that what you're getting is from reliable sources and never just assume anything about animals. That's why these videos take longer for us to make, because even though we may think we know something, there's maybe some new paper, some recent paper that changes our perspective or our outlook on something. And that's why it's always really important to know how to research and be able to do really good research when you're going to talk about things like that, because it does affect conservation efforts for the animal. So rhinos, they've got great vision. And they also, even though Lane said they're not as aggressive as hippos, they can get quite aggressive towards other animals. Rhinos have been recorded killing lions with their horns, just lions that were resting nearby. I'm sure some people have seen videos of overambitious lions going after a rhino, and there are situations where lions and hyenas are able to kill calves and subadults in poor body condition. That's another thing that we've brought up in previous videos. Predators aren't going for the healthiest individuals because that's dangerous. They want to minimize their injury. But rhinos are rather immune to predation, especially at these big, healthy adult sizes. Both the white rhino and the black rhino really don't have to deal with predation that much. And that's important, but also they can get aggressive towards herbivores. There's a record of a bull white rhino killing a hippo. It used its horns to gore and kill a hippo. And, that doesn't happen if it's just some peaceful, gentle giant. And it most absolutely can see where that hippo was. I think a lot of, what has made people kind of say rhinos are garbage or rhinos are dumb is comparing them to elephants, which, it's not really a fair comparison. They're two very different animals that use landscapes in very different ways. And it really does undermine what makes the rhino so special and important on the landscape. Let's talk about the babies. Let's talk about the babies before
babies first. Okay.
Yeah. So we don't have any calves in this enclosure, unfortunately. However, we do have photos up for us to look at the calves. The calves, I'm looking at the white rhino calf right now. It looks good. I definitely think the white rhino in general does not look as good as the black rhino. I think it's just like it's kind of shiny and it's got like a little bit of cartoon in the eye again, whereas like looking at this lovely black rhino, it's just so sharp. It's got the dark eyes, like the color looks great. But I mean, the white rhino still looks really good. I don't want to make it sound like the white rhino looks bad. It's just compared to the black rhino looks amazing. But I haven't actually seen the black rhino calf at all. And I'm not seeing a picture of it when I look it up.
Yeah, I'm not finding it either. Actually, wait, I did find one. um, on like one of the official images. Yeah,
How's it
it looks good.
Yeah.
Because you know it kind of has like the sloped face,
Yeah.
um,
I
and
feel,
like
I
kind
feel
of
like at least the white one really captures the head, like
yeah, exactly. And
the
I think
big blocky head with the like
mhm.
little bumps as the horns grow in.
Yeah, and I think the black rhino captures that, you know, at least the head really well for the calf as well.
And does it have like the appropriate lip on it too?
It looks like it, yeah. So it has
Yeah,
kind of
because
the
I know it's
curve.
it's wider than it is in the adults, but you still have that upper hook on it.
Yeah.
And I guess something that we forgot to mention is the reason rhinos use their lips so much when they feed, even the grazing white rhino, is because they don't really have, big, powerful front teeth. So
Mhm.
they don't have those incisors. So they're really using their lips to kind of shove and initially start feeding. So lips are really, really important to rhinos in that regard. But of course, one of the biggest things with rhinos is conservation. So we're going to move into talking about the conservation of both the white rhino and the black rhino now. These guys used to be very widespread, and that isn't really the case anymore. And that is mainly due to poaching. So the illegal harvesting and killing of rhinos because of their horns. And this is because in East Asian markets, like in China and Vietnam, the rhino horn is considered to be a powerful medicine that can cure a lot of different sicknesses. However, structurally, as we've said, even though we call a lot of different things horns, they're not necessarily the same structure. So rhino horns in particular, you do have kind of this, if you ever look at a rhino skull, you do have kind of this bump at the base where the horn grows out of that has some bone to it. But the rest of the horn is keratin. And keratin is the same material that makes up your hair and your fingernails. And it's the same across all mammals. And it's probably also in other vertebrates as well. But it is that same structure. So if you think that powdered rhino horn is going to cure your fever, well, your fingernail clippings and cut pieces of hair would essentially do the same because they're structurally the same. Even though the rhino horn looks impressive, that's what it is. So yeah, it doesn't cure anything because it's just keratin. Another thing that's a bit lesser known is that in Yemen, which is a Middle Eastern country, rhino horns are often fashioned as dagger handles, and that's another pressure on rhino poaching. And as a big mega herbivore, a big mammalian mega herbivore, rhinos don't breed that quickly. So when you start killing loads and loads of rhinos, they're not going to be able to breed fast enough to compensate for that pressure. As I said, they're mega herbivores. Their defense against predators a lot of the time is just sheer bulk and being too dangerous for things like lions and spotted hyenas to tackle. So when you start having this very high harvest, it's not something that the animal's really well equipped to deal with. And we used to have different rhino species all across Europe, Asia, even into Alaska with the woolly rhino that many people are familiar with in the Pleistocene. And we lost a lot of those rhinos, and that could be due to a combination of over harvest by early humans as well as climatic changes from losing other mega herbivores is definitely a possibility there. But the rhino situation has gotten quite dire, more so in Asia, but even in Africa, things have gotten really tough. So the white rhinoceros is surprisingly doing quite well compared to other rhinos, specifically the southern white rhinoceros that we have pictured here. There is another subspecies, the northern white rhinoceros, which is functionally extinct. There's only two females left on a particular reserve in Kenya. The last male made international news when he died a couple years back. And we do have, there has been a considerable amount of effort to use a lot of frozen gametes that have been cryogenically frozen at different zoos to try and maybe have the chance to clone northern white rhinos and bring them back. I think there's about 14 embryos that they're trying to work with on that right now. But in a lot of other places, they've just been, because the southern white rhino is doing fairly well, it's listed as near threatened. So it's not even in the threatened category, though it is quite close on that cusp. So it is something to be aware of. You're still worried about poaching. They're still not in a whole lot of areas. They're doing quite well in South Africa and in Namibia, of course, as well as a couple other countries. But it's still something that they're still doing quite great comparatively. And that's led to a lot of more northern African countries that used to have northern white rhinos reintroducing southern white rhinos. So Garamba National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo, they just got 14 white rhinos from South Africa a couple weeks ago that are in an acclimation pen, and they're planning to restore white rhino to the DRC because of that. Rwanda had a southern white rhino reintroduction. I believe the Ivory Coast in West Africa also got southern white rhinos reintroduced, and they would have had the northern white. So I think at this point, it's kind of like, well, do we need to care about the individual subspecies, or is it more important to just have white rhinos in general on these landscapes? And that's kind of the assessment that certain countries are deciding whether or not they want to make, given the situation of the northern white rhino, which is actually kind of crazy because, believe it or not, way back when the poaching crisis was at its peak, the southern white rhino was thought to be extinct, and all faith was on the northern white rhino, and the roles have completely reversed now with the the northern white functionally extinct. We were able to find southern white rhinos, hiding away in South Africa, and South Africa's got a lot of private ownership laws. So there became a lot of private ownership of white rhinos in South Africa on these private reserves where they were protected, and they were generating money through trophy hunting to initially give that population a huge breeding boost. And it's kind of plateaued now just from the way that finances and the complexities of everything works in conservation when it is tied to trophy hunting. But it is like a huge step in the right direction. Then, of course, with the black rhino, that for the most part, they are quite seriously endangered. However, the southwestern subspecies of black rhino, the one that is found in Namibia, is doing quite well. That's why we modeled this habitat off of Namibia, is because it's one of the best places in the world to see rhinos. They've been doing a great deal of rhino protection in Namibia. However, you also have the southern or south central black rhino, which it's doing okay, but still quite endangered. And you also have the eastern black in places like Kenya and Tanzania, the more stereotypical spots of Africa that you think about, where they're critically endangered. And finally, you have the western black rhinoceros in West Africa, which is entirely extinct. We don't even have any specimens left in captivity at all. So it is a really dire situation. A lot of this, we need to be doing very strict anti-poaching regimens, which has been great. Having local law enforcement really protecting rhinos. I mean, there's some areas where rhinos are under 24-hour guard. It's that bad, where we can't really afford to be losing rhinos that much. And another thing that has been going on is dehorning rhinos. So chemically immobilizing a rhino and sawing off a good chunk of the horn. As I said, the horn structure, there is kind of that base at the bottom where the horn grows out of, that's also bone. You can't cut that off because you can seriously injure the rhino, but you are able to take off about 93% of the horn. So there is still a little bit of horn that's got a little bit of value. And just to kind of give you an idea of how valuable this horn is, powdered rhino horn is more valuable than cocaine per kilo. So there's a whole market. It's all this one big syndicate of these absolute scumbags in the world, and they're exploiting all of these things. And they're really bad people, but at the same time, they're taking advantage of more financially poor local people that know where the rhinos go, and they say, hey, if you want to make this money, I'll provide you the equipment, I'll provide you the guns, get me a rhino horn and I'll pay you. And they're probably not getting that much of the pay. As I said, it's worth that much money, but the amount that they are getting is enough to help feed their families and etc. So it is an important pressure to understand. And so even these dehorned rhinos can still get poached, whether it's for that little sliver of horn or because they don't want to have to track a dehorned rhino again, and want to, they don't want to track it again, so they'll just kill it so they don't have to worry about that individual rhino ever again if they're going to keep poaching in that area, is something that you see. And finally, another thing to consider with dehorned rhinos is that the horn does grow back, and it does grow back faster in males. And that is something to consider, that it's going to be expensive to constantly be immobilizing and dehorning rhinos. And while there has been a lot of debate on the subject where people talk about, oh, does dehorning these rhinos, does it increase their mortality or not? It seems like the current consensus is that it doesn't. However, it does have social impacts on black rhino, especially black rhino, where black rhino will have smaller territories and they'll interact with members of the same species less frequently. Because as we said before, these horns are very important in their social structure, and males will combat with each other from time to time, even males and females and other females, they will fight each other with those horns. And if you lose those horns, you're less likely to want to get into that conflict. But at the same time, in a lot of areas where they don't dehorn rhinos killing each other in territorial bouts is one of the biggest causes of mortality. So, it is saving rhino lives in that regard from each other. But whether or not this is the best long-term solution, I think is up there in debate. I think for sure it's not the end-all be-all. You still need to have great law enforcement, even with dehorning of rhinos, for sure. And there is a lot of talk about, well, maybe there's a point where we could have a legal rhino horn trade that really goes into making sure that we have a sustainable amount of harvest and that rhinos are able to exist in multiple areas. And there's a lot of analysis papers that I personally agree with that kind of shows you're still having demand for rhino horn. And as long as that demand is there, there's going to be people that cannot take advantage of the farming of rhino for the legal trade. And so those more economically impoverished people, they're still going to have an incentive to poach. And so really the best thing that we can do for rhinos is eliminating the demand for their horns, understanding that this doesn't work as the medicine that you think it does, and really taking the incentive to, protect these animals for what they are, and realizing that their horns, are valuable on themselves. And a lot of this work that, I've been talking about with conservation, Save the Rhino International is a huge NGO that covers all 5 rhino species. They've been doing a lot of fantastic work with protecting rhinos in a lot of these methods that I've been describing. So definitely check them out. And they're a great resource if you're somebody that's maybe interested in going long-term and wanting to do a career, particularly in rhino conservation. They'd be a great contact to reach out to for sure.
And another group that does a lot with rhinos is the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. Because I know at their safari park, they have a decent amount of Southern White Rhinos that I believe they're kind of perfecting the methods that they would use to bring back the Northern White Rhino on the Southern White Rhino. And because they just had a calf that was born that way, like just a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm. I didn't know that they had a calf that was born. That's great. Because San Diego Zoo's been very big on taking the frozen embryos and using that cloning technology to kind of help along like functionally extinct or critically endangered, extinct in the wild species. That's that's the where I want the cloning technology to be. Everybody focuses
Yeah,
on
exactly.
Jurassic Park and woolly mammoths and stuff, and I'm like, no, this is what we need to be using it on, because these are animals that we know where we'll put them, we know how they behave, we know how we can protect them. Let's work with what we've got. So it's really great to see that happening, and it also does stress the importance of zoos in conservation, and that they do contribute a lot. And there are several species that we would have lost entirely if it wasn't for captive populations and recovery programs partnering with zoos.
Yeah, and it's actually the San Diego Zoo Safari Park was where I saw one of the last northern white rhinos that was in the United States.
Yeah.
Like I think like 6 years ago or so.
Right. Yeah.
So
So
really connects people with, a species that otherwise, they would never have seen in their life. So
and I know that people keep poo-pooing it in favor of elephants, but I mean, there is just something prehistoric about rhinos, and they are magnificent in their own complete right, and they are amazing animals that we really, really do need to protect, for sure. All right. Hi, everybody. As you notice, Lane is not here right now, and we're wearing different shirts, and that's because we forgot about recording this segment because we've been doing so many carnivores. So we're also going to go back and we're going to review the interspecies enrichment that is within the game for both the Southern White Rhino and the Black Rhino. And just looking right off the bat for the Southern White Rhino, I am noticing I think most of these are really good. Like, these are all species that they would be living with in the wild. White rhinos are pretty commonly housed with other species together. So like in zoos, so it is like common for you to see a lot of these, but even then there's like some where it's either not commonly housed together with white rhinos in zoos, or they aren't at all, but they're species that they still overlap with naturally quite well. And so some of the ones that I'm noticing that aren't listed, hippopotamus and African bush elephant, of course, are the two big ones. I think the problem, especially with like hippos and elephants, is you just see always videos of them fighting with each other, when it's like that's a really rare behavior, especially with the elephants killing rhinos. That's very specific to young bulls that are insecure, or they're in muss, which means that they have a testosterone surge that makes them really violent. It's not something that normally happens a lot of the time with elephants and rhinos. So in the wild, they do overlap pretty well. They're fine. They don't conflict most of the time, and they're able to partition accordingly. So those are two herbivores I'm really noticing aren't on here. Hemsbach is not on here as well, which is, of course, Southern White Rhino. And that's a very common Southern African antelope, but they did put springbok on there. So that's good. Thompson's gazelle, I did double check. There are Southern White Rhinos reintroduced to Kenya, so they do overlap with Thompson's gazelle. Everything else is, they overlap really good. Reticulated giraffe does not with the Southern White. It overlaps with the Northern White, but not right now, obviously, because Northern Whites are functionally extinct. But reticulated giraffes, like very more like Northeast African giraffe. So yes, Southern White Rhinos overlap with a bunch of different giraffes, just not the reticulated one.
And I bet they put that one in there specifically because zoos like house them, in the same habitats sometimes. So it's not like while in the wild they wouldn't cohabitate because of range differences, but functionally they can.
And it's like easy too, because like giraffe's a browser, white rhino's a grazer, so they're not really competing for like the same plant material within their enclosure. Which is really nice partitioning. And then obviously the predators aren't here. I'm not going to mention the lion for this one because it's very specifically West African lion, and white rhinos, as far as we know from our records, were never in West Africa. And but spotted hyena, striped hyena, I guess something really small would probably be meerkat. Meerkat's not on here. And And then actually, I was doing a little bit of brief looking. There's a zoo in Sweden that houses southern white rhinos with cheetahs with
Interesting.
no
Yeah.
conflict. Yeah.
Which
So,
makes sense. Cheetahs are a pretty docile.
well, they're also
Well,
just like
yeah,
like you need to
yeah,
have a pretty big coalition of males to even think about taking on even a rhino calf.
yeah.
So, but that was just like really cool that was like a real example of a zoo housing these two species together. And I wouldn't expect them to put cheetah
Mhm.
on the list, but it's interesting that that has worked, of course. Is there anything else I am missing? I have a list of all the African animals up just in case. Um I think that's kind of it for the most part. So they got like most of the herbivores. It's really just like the carnivores, a couple of those larger. Oh, warthog.
Mm.
Warthog's not on there for some weird reason. They do overlap with warthogs. But I think yeah, besides that, yeah, I mean it's the big herbivores, so bush elephant and hippopotamus, and then a lot of the carnivores like meerkat, African wild dog, spotted and striped hyena, Nile monitor. But yeah, I mean the herbivores that you're probably gonna house it with, chances are it does have some sort of interspecies enrichment coded into the game, which is really nice. But yeah, I guess reticulated giraffes kind of the oddball, but as we said, they do overlap with white rhinos in a historical intact ecosystem setting. They
Mhm.
just don't right now, and it's with the northern white. So I think that covers everything for the white rhino. Then we can check the black rhino. Yeah, so they're saying that the black rhino doesn't have any interspecies enrichment at all, which is probably tying into the fact that it's more aggressive than the white rhino.
Mm.
They're still housed with a lot of those same herbivores that we've covered with the white rhino, like even in zoos, and they overlap with all. They actually overlap with the reticulated giraffe more.
Mm.
I think the black rhinos in that area, they're either super endangered or they are already extinct. But there is more of that overlap because the black rhino does go further east into like that Horn of Africa region, or at least it used to. It's probably been eliminated from there from heavy poaching, so it would have overlapped with, for example, the Somali wild ass, which was added in the arid pack as well. They also went further into kind of that north central into West Africa historically. So places like most of Sudan and Chad and Niger, and even further into some of those West African countries. So they would have been historically overlapping with things like the scimitar horned oryx as well. West African lion, which we did mention, the lions in West Africa, they would have been overlapping with black rhinos there, but not white rhinos because white rhinos don't seem to have been in that part, at least within modern human history.
Mm.
Porcupine, that's another one that was added in the arid pack that would overlap. I think everything else, though, I think was already covered with the white rhino. I don't think there's anything else that's distinct. Maybe chimpanzee. I'm not confident on that one, though. Chimpanzees do go into more like woodland savanna, so it's definitely
Yeah.
possible. But I wouldn't commit to it. But it is a possibility that they did historically overlap at some point. But yeah, I think Nile Lechwe is another one that they would have overlapped. But yeah, overall, like black rhino should have more interspecies enrichment with a lot of the same animals that the southern white rhino does. So I don't know why they didn't do that, which is a shame
Especially if,
because the black rhino looks so good.
yeah, especially with it being a DLC animal and added later, you would think that it would have, you know, more consideration to the interspecies enrichment.
Yeah, and I feel like they've done a very good job of like updating
Hmm.
what animals get enrichment when new ones are added with the DLC. So this is kind of surprising to me that it literally does not have any benefits. It's kind of like the hippo where I think they're maybe just kind of doing that kind of surface level analysis instead of looking at like, oh well, like
Hmm.
I mean, hippo makes more sense because I
Yeah.
really don't think, aside from like small birds, you're really housing your hippo with that much in the zoo. But in the wild, they're overlapping with just about everything.
Yeah.
So with black rhino, not only is it they're overlapping with a lot in their natural habitat because that's how ecosystems work, but also they are put with other herbivores pretty frequently in zoos as well. So I pulled them up ahead of time, make it a little bit easier for us. So who wants to go first?
You can go ahead, Dominic.
All right. So I'm gonna start off. For me, the black rhino is an easy S tier. It looks so good. I am so happy with what we got for it. And the white rhino is still also really good. But I think there's just some minor things with kind of the texture and the brightness of it a little bit on the eyes as well, where I would be more comfortable putting that in A tier. But I think the black rhino for me is my first S tier.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the Black Rhino deserves a S tier. And then I would also put the white in the A tier just based on the lighting, like you said, and a couple of other things. I do want to mention, however, I did like that they showed the difference in size a little bit between the white and black rhino
Yeah.
because the white is just a little bit bigger.
I mean,
But
the
yeah,
white is like white rhinos are bigger than hippos. Like
yeah,
they're
yeah,
big animals. And
yeah,
black rhino is not as big as a hippo. So
yeah. That's where I would land as well.
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with you guys. The Black Rhino I would place in S tier. It looks really good. The they got all the details like the prehensile lip, the horns, and for me the ears are really spot on. The way that
yeah,
they kind of like are, positioned and they kind of swivel around.
the
Um,
eyes too. I really like the eyes on the
and
black.
then I would also put the Southern White Rhino in A tier, just like you guys. Because yeah, I think my only issues were some of its animations were a little weird with the overall body texture.
Yeah, it
But
was holding its head kind of high when it like
mhm,
ran around too.
yeah,
Whereas they kind of keep it a bit more like horizontal.
but aside from that, like the head shape is really good.
Yeah.
The overall size, like Lane mentioned. So yeah, I'd say S and A tier.
All right. So now we need to determine where the white rhino is going in A tier compared to everything
Mm,
else.
that's true.
um, do I think it's better than the lynx? Is the question.
Mm,
I think it's better than the okapi
yeah,
Mm,
for
yeah,
sure.
I'd agree with that.
Better than okapi, worse than lynx is your vote.
Hmm.
yeah. I think I would agree. I think the
All right.
lynx is just a little bit better.
Okay then. So that is where we're at. Poor little red fox is bottom, but we are recording this actually before the red fox videos even come out. So but we will get to spin the wheel. But before we spin the wheel, Lane, I think you have an important announcement for our viewers.
Yeah, just a little update. Things are getting a little bit more busy for me in my life. Moving down to Logan, Utah to start my master's program and just kind of getting things settled there. So I'm gonna be taking a little bit of a break just to get settled and get everything kind of started with that program, meeting people and making sure I'm in the right places. But hopefully after I'm settled, I can join back up again. But yeah, it's been fun to be on while I can and hopefully join back up again later on.
Yep, it's been great having you, Lane, and we wish you the best of luck with the start of your masters. We know how important that is, and I'm sure we'll get you back in whenever. Obviously, we're gonna need your vote to break ties for a while, so we'll still be asking you questions in the meantime. And for you viewers, leave a comment to let Lane know how you're happy and excited for him in this new chapter of his life, because this is really important for steps in being a research and conservation scientist. So getting that advanced degree really does matter. So we're very happy and proud for Lane, and we wish him the best of luck in his first semester. So
Thanks,
with that,
thanks.
are you ready to spin the wheel. Raccoon.
Raccoon.
Okay.
Nice. That'll be an interesting one.
There we go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
will be for sure.
Cool.
All right. Well, that's all we have. We are the Wildlife Wire signing off.
Yeah.
Bye.